It's going to be a fun one, Katie. It's a pleasure to sit down with you in a more formal sense, since we're mostly informal.
Likewise, Kyle. Thanks for inviting me.
So, for those of you that don't know Katie, she is one of the partners at Andreessen Horowitz, but more importantly, the former U.S. attorney here in San Francisco who prosecuted the Bitcoin Silk Road case. We're going to talk about a lot of interesting things today. And for the Real Vision crowd, I think talking a lot about crypto digital assets will come more at the end. But let's go back to your law school days and talk about which Supreme Court justice you clerked for and why, and then how that brought you into being working in the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Well, it's funny, Kyle. I wasn't actually planning to be a prosecutor. Some people think, I'm going to go to law school and go be a corporate M&A lawyer or go into international business or go be a public defender. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to go to law school, and that's something that I had always wanted to do, even from the early days. And so, I went to Stanford, and there I really was focused on going to New York City. And so I signed up, I took the New York bar, and I was planning to go work at Cravath, Swaine & Moore, which is a big Wall Street firm.
Yeah.
And one of the things I realized, though, was that what was really interesting me in law were the kind of human stories and the human element, whether you're talking about things like employment law or especially criminal law. And ironically, my best grades were not from the transactional kind of classes, like the corporate law or the securities and capital markets classes, but from the criminal law or the constitutional law side of things.
Wow.
So maybe that was an early sign.
It was, and clearly it's what drew me to you as we developed our friendship over time. Is this? You're one of the coolest ladies that I know. You're one of the few people in San Francisco that can carry a gun. You've prosecuted some of the worst MS-13 cases, as well as, again, the Bitcoin Silk Road case, which I'd love to get into a little bit next. I know that there are movies being made about this and things like that. But if you would, I think this talk, what people are going to find to be most interesting about our conversation is how you came from law enforcement on the criminal side into the investment universe and to being a partner at one of the most prestigious venture capital firms in the world.
I was fortunate to clerk for Justice Kennedy. And I remember that he asked me in my interview, I'll never forget, he asked me, what do you want to do when you leave here? What's your kind of 5-year or 10-year career plan? And I told him, I want to go be a prosecutor. And I knew by that point that I really felt strongly that I wanted to be involved in the criminal justice system in some way. And that was quite a shift from the early days of when I thought I was going to go be a corporate lawyer in New York City. And I went to work for a big law firm in Washington, D.C., and I told the partner, very candidly, my goal here, the partner who hired me, my goal is to really go into the U.S. Attorney's Office. And fortunately, that was a firm called Sidley Austin. They were really they appreciated the transparency and said that, it's a tough nut to crack, but if you can get into that office, good for you. And 10 months later, I found myself there. And that was out in the Washington, D.C. area. It was in the Eastern District of Virginia, called the Rocket Docket. Because the Rocket Docket, so named because of the pace with which cases go through. And we were doing cartel cases there, a lot of the international work that the DEA was doing. So that's where I kind of cut my teeth as a baby prosecutor, was in this Rocket Docket. And then I was out also in headquarters working on some national security cases and also working in the Attorney General's office. But in 2008, I went, they call it back to the line being a prosecutor. So I had been in some senior roles in headquarters, working on national security and things implicating national policy, and went back to the line of prosecuting cases, which is what I loved.
And that's when they sent you to San Francisco?
I actually chose to move out here, mostly for family reasons. And I had been in D.C. by that point for 8 years, which was a nice long time.
But you got involved in some really interesting cases really quickly, right? Some were gang-related and some were, again, then the Bitcoin case came, and that was a big one. So if you would, take us right into the Bitcoin case.
Sure. Well, so it was around 2012, late 2012, I think it was. And my boss came into the office. I had been doing, murder cases and organized crime and RICO gang murders up until then, and had done a few trials. I did a 2-month biker murder case, and was felt like I had been there and done that with a lot of violent crime cases. And my boss knew that I really was looking for a change, but I still wanted to stay in the office. And they proposed, why don't you work on this new case that we have in the office? And that's a case against Bitcoin. Here we were in 2012, 2013, and we quickly learned there's no such thing as prosecuting Bitcoin. That would be like prosecuting cash.
Right.
It's not possible. We also quickly discovered it's not desirable, right? There were some really good things about this new technology also. Instead, what we did was we said, let's, just like we do with cash or wires or any medium of exchange, let's focus on the bad uses of this, right? And that same thing happened in the early days of tech and in the early days of the internet, right? It wasn't let's prosecute technology. It was like, let's stand up a computer crimes unit within the Justice Department and go after the nefarious cases using this technology. So that's how we were approaching Bitcoin in those early days. And there were a lot of bad, nefarious uses involving crypto. And in those days, when I say crypto now, I mean crypto assets are, there are more than 1,500 of them. Back in those days, we're talking really just about
Handful.
Bitcoin.
Yep.
We're talking about Bitcoin. This is
Just
pre-Ether.
Bitcoin. And in your mind, what percentage of the transactions that were going on in, let's just say, Bitcoin early on were done kind of, say, for dark reasons as opposed to for reasons of commerce?
In those early days?
Yeah.
Well, in the early days, the percentages were way higher, right? Because
Right.
the thing we know about criminals is that they're often the earliest adopters of new technology.
Right.
We saw this
And
with
they
the
love the
internet.
anonymity of this one, yeah.
The anonymity, but it turns out it's not anonymous, which I'll get into. It's
Okay.
pseudonymous, and there's an important distinction there
Okay.
because Bitcoin is far from anonymous. If anything, it's like digital breadcrumbs. Speaking as a former investigator and prosecutor, we actually loved cases that involved Bitcoin way more than cash.
Right.
And sometimes even more than wires, because it turns out Bitcoin is highly traceable, which I'll get into as I tell you a little bit about this
Great.
story.
So what happened?
So we're prosecuting some early cases involving criminal uses of Bitcoin. And my colleagues out in New York were prosecuting a case known as the Silk Road. And at that time, no one really knew who was running the Silk Road, right? The government was really trying to find out who was running the Silk Road. Where were the people or person, he or she, it was unknown at the time who it was running the Silk Road, and where were they doing it from? Little did they know they were doing it right here from San Francisco. At that time, the mastermind of the Silk Road could have been anywhere in the world. And so the U.S. government was really trying to find out who was running this criminal enterprise, or, depending on your perspective, libertarian paradise.
So the Silk Road was essentially a marketplace, from the way I understand it.
Yes,
and again,
it was.
correct me, I'm not an expert in these things. And the marketplace had various, nefarious items
Right.
on it. So what were some of the things
Yeah.
that the Silk Road was purveying?
Sure, well, you're exactly right, Kyle. It was a marketplace, right? It was an online marketplace, kind of like an eBay or an Amazon. But more akin to an eBay. So there were vendors, right, on this marketplace. And Silk Road was an online platform, and you could access it using Tor, which, do you know what Tor is?
No.
It stands for the Onion Router.
Okay.
And it's basically a way to anonymously browse online.
This is the dark web.
Well, actually, you access parts of the dark web with Tor. Tor
Got
is
it.
the browser.
Got it.
So think of Tor as the kind of Chrome or
the-
Internet Explorer.
I see. For the
Okay.
dark web.
For the dark web.
Okay.
Not just for the dark web. Like anything with technology, right? People are also using the Tor browser in places like Iran or China.
So the dark web.
Well, there are good uses for. All I'm saying is there are good
Okay.
uses for the Tor browser. There are also a lot of bad uses for
Got
the Tor
it.
browser, right?
Yeah.
So, like anything with technology, there are good and bad uses. But
Sure.
absolutely, people who are accessing the dark web, which I grant you are people that are up to no good typically, are accessing the dark websites using Tor browsers.
Okay.
Or
Yeah.
a Tor browser.
Yeah.
And so Silk Road was one such online marketplace. And like I always say, was it a criminal enterprise? Being a former prosecutor, I sure think so. Or was it a libertarian paradise? Because I also know a lot of people, especially here in San Francisco, who think it's not a criminal enterprise. Everyone should be able to choose whatever they want to buy. One could go buy anything from heroin to fake passports and to a lot of things in between.
Wow.
And by the way, Silk Road,
And they just mail them to your house?
yeah.
My
Yeah,
goodness.
well, typically for sophisticated actors or users of Silk
Right.
Road, they wouldn't pick their house.
Right.
But there were plenty of people who indeed did select their house,
Got
right?
it.
And the Silk Road was making millions of dollars a month, and they had generating a lot of revenues. And I believe it was, I'm trying to remember how exactly the case got opened in New York, but I believe hearing that Senator Schumer read a Wired article and was wondering why this was being allowed to proceed.
Wow.
Yeah, and so the Southern District of New York, which was another U.S. Attorney's office, I was in the U.S. Attorney's office out in San Francisco.
Yep.
SDNY opened a case and was trying to figure out who was behind the Silk Road. At the same time, D.C., you had a D.C. office just in Baltimore, outside of D.C., also trying to figure out who was running the Silk Road. And there were parallel investigations going in. And the government had task forces comprised of, an alphabet soup of agencies. You're talking about FBI, Secret Service, DEA, ATF, Marshals, on and on. And one task force, the one out of Washington, D.C., well, Baltimore and Washington, D.C., they had an undercover agent. And that undercover agent was able to befriend the person running the Silk Road. And all the government knew at the time was that the person running the Silk Road went by the nickname DPR, for Dread Pirate Roberts. You know that from the movie The Princess Bride?
Yes.
Yeah. So they didn't know who DPR was, but the undercover agent,
Struck up an online relationship with him.
exactly, he actually said, "I want to buy the Silk Road."
Okay.
So struck up an online conversation with DPR. And proceeded for the next 2 years to engage in messaging conversations with DPR. The two actually became quite close confidants.
Interesting.
Yeah, over 2 years.
And then what went wrong?
Well, a lot of things went wrong on both sides. From the Silk Road side, 2013 was a really bad year for the Silk Road because what you had a person, an online persona, who went by the name Death from Above. Death from Above started extorting DPR, saying, if you don't pay me hundreds of thousands of dollars in Bitcoin, I'm going to reveal your identity to law enforcement. And then, meanwhile, there was another online persona, and this person went by the moniker French Maid. I can't make these names up, really.
I know.
French Maid was selling DPR information into the government's investigation. And French Maid, for Bitcoin,
Right.
and French Maid was telling DPR the feds are closing in and the end is near. And you're about to be had.
So French Maid, in theory, had to be someone either married to or was part of the government's investigation.
Well, DPR didn't know, but DPR paid for that information.
Okay.
And the government didn't know any of this at the time, of course. This all came out after the fact. But amidst this, something else really bad happened to the
What
Silk
else
Road.
happened in 2013?
About 21,000 Bitcoins, which is today in excess of, I always have to do the calculation given how Bitcoin is moving, but it's in excess of $150 million, I think,
Okay.
today, went missing overnight from the Silk Road. From Silk Road vendor accounts and also from what you might consider the petty cash account. Although there's
Wow.
nothing petty about 21,000 Bitcoins.
Right.
And so that went missing overnight, and DPR was, of course, infuriated the next day. He thought he'd been hacked, so he launched his own internal investigation. And he quickly discovered, so he thought, his right-hand man, the Silk Road administrator, was responsible for this theft.
And it was of 21,000 Bitcoin.
21,000 Bitcoin.
Okay.
So whatever the figure is today, it's in excess of $100 million.
Yep.
Right? And so the right-hand man, the Silk Road administrator, it turns out, was a grandfather living in Utah by the name of Curtis Green.
Okay.
Okay? And Curtis Green, what DPR didn't know was that Curtis Green, his right-hand man, was already cooperating with the feds by this point, with those task forces that I mentioned to you earlier.
The feds had found him.
The feds had found Curtis Green in what's called a buy-bust operation.
Okay.
Okay?
All right.
Where they delivered some keys of coke to his house. There's a Wired article story about the bust, and Curtis Green said, I'd like to cooperate and spare myself a long sentence, and I can help you with the Silk Road.
Right.
And so that's what he did. He sat down with the federal task force, the one I mentioned, outside of Baltimore, and he showed them how did the Silk Road work? How do you log into it? How do you reset vendor PINs and passwords? Of course, he had that access because he was a key administrator.
Right.
Right? So he was showing this federal task force that day, here's how it works. And he even gave them his laptop to keep because it was evidence, right?
Right.
So they had it. And that becomes important to the story later, that they had the access, they had the login credentials.
They actually became an administrator.
They could have.
for the
Okay.
Silk Road.
They certainly could have. They had the
Okay.
tools to do that
Yep.
and the know-how.
Yep.
And what ended up happening was in this 21,000 Bitcoins goes missing overnight. DPR looks into it and says, hey, it's Curtis Green's pins and passwords that have allowed this to all be drained. And Curtis Green, therefore, must have committed this theft. And actually, I want to have a hit put out on him
To kill Curtis Green.
to kill Curtis Green.
Oh my.
So he paid about $80,000 in 2 installments of $40,000. Interestingly, not in Bitcoin, just in a pure old-fashioned wire. And guess who he turned to do the hit?
Who?
The undercover federal agent who had befriended DPR.
Yes.
He had a code name named Knob.
Okay.
Okay, that was his cover.
And that's who he turned to in the murder for hire.
DPR turned to Knob, not knowing Knob was actually an undercover federal agent.
Right.
DPR thought Knob was actually a drug lord with connections to the criminal underworld. All he knew is the two had only ever conversed online for 2 years, but he clearly trusted Knob. That's who he asked to help him torture and murder Curtis Green.
Wow. And so what happened next?
So, of course, the feds, now they have Curtis Green cooperating. They confront Curtis Green the next day and say, there's a hit put out on you. And by the way, we know you stole 21,000 Bitcoin. You're not going to make a very good cooperating witness if you don't come clean on that. And Curtis Green was insistent. He had not stolen the money. He pointed out he had turned over his laptop just the day before to the task force, and he didn't have any way that he could have committed this theft. So he was insistent. But the feds had to go about staging Curtis Green's murder. And so they proceeded to take photos, proof of death photos, that depicted a torture and murder of Curtis Green. They sent those to DPR saying the hit's been done.
Wow.
And Curtis Green's dead. Your problem's gone. And we still didn't know, though.
But did DPR ever think he could get the 21,000 Bitcoin back?
Well, I'm not sure
Right.
what he thought. In October 2013, DPR, it was discovered who he was. And he was none other than Ross Ulbricht. He was operating the Silk Road.
What's
Turns
his name?
out, Ross Ulbricht.
Russ Ulbricht, yeah.
He
This
was
is the
operating.
kid from Austin, Texas.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
At that time, still a kid. I mean, I think he was around 20-something at the time.
Right.
And my counterparts in New York arrested him out here in San Francisco in the Glen Park Library in the act of running the Silk Road
From the library.
from Glen Park Library. That's right.
Wow.
Yeah.
On his laptop.
Right. And they needed to catch him in the act. Even though they had identified who he was by then, they needed to catch him in the act because he could have, basically hit the equivalent of a kill switch and destroyed
Really?
a bunch of evidence. Yeah.
Okay.
So the FBI staged a lover's quarrel in the Glen Park Library with 2 undercover agents posing as boyfriend and girlfriend having a big fight. And this distracted Ross Ulbricht, who looked away from his laptop while another FBI agent swooped in and
Grabbed it.
snatched it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And so bringing you in, you investigated some good guys gone bad.
Yeah, that's right.
So what happened in the, how did the good guys go bad and what did they do?
Sure. Well, so I was not actually involved in the Ross Ulbricht prosecution
Right.
or investigation. As I mentioned, that was my colleagues in New York. But in 2014, I was sitting out here in my office in San Francisco in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I got I was talking to a witness in another case. And he pulled me aside and said, I feel like I can trust you and I have a tip for you. And he said, I'm a former investigative reporter, and I know a rat when I see one. And you have a rogue agent on your payroll.
Wow.
Yeah, on the government payroll.
And so what did you do?
I thought we're in San Francisco, and this place is really full of so many conspiracy theorists. So I kind of took it with a grain of salt, honestly, Kyle. I thought I hear all the time, being out here, how the government is conspiring against everyone.
Right.
I kind of secretly, I think, rolled my eyes and thought, whatever. It's a shame this guy is smearing a federal agent's good name.
Right.
But
that
he
would
was,
be my defense too.
yeah, well,
to be
I mean,
clear.
look, I had been working with federal agents by that point for a decade, and they're
sure.
absolutely heroes.
Yep.
Right?
You and I know a lot of them.
99.999% of the time.
Yeah.
And so I, coupled with the fact that I was always hearing these conspiracy theories in San Francisco, and there were a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
But this particular individual was really insistent. And like I mentioned, he emphasized that he had been an investigative reporter And he seemed very insistent. So I thought, look, we'll look into it, if for no other reason than to clear this person's name,
Correct.
right? So we took a high-level dive. This is where the blockchain comes in.
Okay.
We took a high-level dive. And by the way, it's not a popular thing in a prosecutor's office to
Right, to look at one of your own.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that was why kind of the blockchain was particularly useful to us because,
Because you could follow things.
you could follow some things. So we took a high-level look into it, and we saw that this agent who we got the tip for, and by the way, the agent was the undercover agent I mentioned who had been investigating the Silk Road.
Knob.
Correct.
Okay.
And what we found was that Knob was liquidating hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars a month in cryptocurrency. And so I thought, oh, this is probably another undercover operation,
Right.
poorly backstopped, and it's probably not. There's probably a legitimate explanation. So let's look into this a bit further because that does certainly seem odd. So we went to some of these exchanges where Knob was liquidating the crypto, and what we found was that he had actually been emailing these exchanges, directing them to destroy evidence and destroy transaction history.
As an agent of
Correct.
the government.
And that's how we knew something nefarious was probably afoot.
Yeah.
Because as an agent, if you're running an undercover operation, you're not asking for evidence to be destroyed.
No.
You need that as proof and as evidence later. So we then, I think, in our minds, thought this is very odd, and in fact does merit further investigation. And so that's what we did. And so we started looking into it, and then we were, comfortable issuing subpoenas, doing some search warrants on some communications facilities. And what we found was evidence of a pattern of really bad behavior. That's, to put it mildly, not just vis-a-vis the Silk Road and DPR, who was
Right.
Ross Ulbricht.
Right. Other sites.
Other individuals, kind of early users of cryptocurrency, who probably wouldn't have been the ones to report, I've been the victim of a crime, if you catch my drift.
Yes.
Right? And so we started uncovering more and more, and we started looking at the blockchain, and we traced back payments from Knob's accounts where he had liquidated this hundreds of thousands and indeed millions of cryptocurrencies. It turns out Knob had been French made, selling Ross Ulbricht or DPR information into the government's case.
Oh, I see.
But that's not all. It turned out also that Knob had been death from above, extorting Ross Ulbricht and threatening to reveal his identity to law enforcement if he wasn't paid hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Oh, my word. So he created various personas.
He was a double agent,
Yeah.
right? He was playing both sides the whole time. Ross
Yeah.
Ulbricht and DPR, or one and the same.
Right.
And then also the government, right? Because he's supposed to be finding out who is DPR
For the government.
for the government.
Right.
So he
right.
was playing both sides the whole time. And so naturally we thought, oh, he probably also stole that $150 million or the 21,000 Bitcoins, right? Because he had been handling Curtis Green.
Right.
And he had unique access to Curtis Green's laptop, admin credentials and passwords, right? And so he probably also, since he did these other bad things.
Was it him?
Well, so we looked, we thought initially, of course it was him, right? He had access.
Right. He had motive, access, all the above.
Right. But we looked at we traced these payments and the movement of funds.
Right.
The 21,000 Bitcoins, and we traced them to a Japanese cryptocurrency exchange named Mt. Gox that had by then gone belly up. I don't know if you've heard of Mt. Gox.
Mt. Gox was a huge, it was really the big Bitcoin scandal where all of a sudden
Right.
so many Bitcoins went missing.
That's right. It was Mt. Gox suffered a series of hacks to the
Right.
tune of almost $400 million.
Right.
It also suffered a U.S. government seizure and eventually went belly up. And so we traced the 21,000 Bitcoins to Mt. Gox, but unfortunately, there were no corporate records left because Mt. Gox had kind of gone belly up.
Okay.
So what do we do then, right? And this is where the blockchain comes in. We're able to still trace because the blockchain is immutable and permanent, and it's tamper-proof.
Right. Series of records.
Right. So we still were able to go to that and trace those funds. And we traced it eventually through the hard work of some agents who I was working with at the time, some of the agents who were investigating some of these early cryptocurrency cases. We traced it right back to one of the Silk Road task forces, but not to Knob.
What do you mean? Another agent?
Another agent, this time a Secret Service agent who was joint duty to the NSA. And he was the U.S. government's literally expert in Tor and anonymizing technologies. He had also been part of that task force. And he had also been in that session with Curtis Green where Curtis Green showed him how to log in.
Right.
And that agent that night went back to his hotel room after the Curtis Green debrief and pretended to be Curtis Green and drained the 21,000 Bitcoins.
Oh, my word.
And put it into his own Mt. Gox account.
Yeah.
Right. And meanwhile, knowing the next day that there had been a hit put out on Curtis Green.
Right.
And literally thought he was setting up Curtis Green to be the fall guy.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And never to be caught. So
never to be caught because he was a real specialist at covering his tracks. I mean, both of these agents were, right?
Right.
These guys had been federal law enforcement. They knew how criminals got caught.
right.
They knew how to cover their tracks. And also, don't forget, Kyle, at the time of this investigation, they were federal agents with guns and badges.
Right.
And they also had subpoena power. And so
Right.
these guys did everything from burned evidence in burn bags, in official government burn bags, to go to different cryptocurrency exchanges with their badges saying, delete this evidence, and to banks, by the way. And they even, in the case of Knob, even issued fictitious Justice Department subpoenas directing certain activity be done to cover their tracks.
Let's move from the Bitcoin Silk Road case.
Sure.
Let's talk about how you decided to make that transition from a prosecutor, an amazing prosecutor, to the investment world, and what drove you there?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that it was really anything that drove me there. I kind of made the decision after having been a federal prosecutor for over a decade that it was probably time for me to move on to something else. My earliest supervisor in the Eastern District of Virginia, in the Rocket Docket, I remember him telling me in the beginning, a good prosecutor has a shelf life of 7 to 10 years. And I'll never forget that. And I think that's true. It's like that sweet spot where you've learned how to do things and make cases and bring the right and the good cases really well. But then also it's time to move on and give someone else an opportunity to do these cases, right?
Right.
And so I kind of knew when I was kind of giving away federal murder trials to other prosecutors in the office that my time had come to go do something else.
Okay.
And moreover, there was this new space, crypto. I found it very fascinating. And look, we're in this jurisdiction where there's so much happening in the technology world, right? I'm out here in Silicon Valley, and I kind of felt like two things. One, I felt like I had done everything I wanted to do as a prosecutor, right? And two, there's this whole other world of technology and cybersecurity and crypto,
Yeah.
and I found that so fascinating.
You're already living where the digital gold rush was.
Right, exactly. And so increasingly, and by the way, as part of my job when I was an assistant U.S. attorney in the San Francisco office, I became our first digital assets coordinator.
Right.
And part of that job, it wasn't just to go prosecute the bad uses of cryptocurrency. It was also to create a kind of task force, to be a liaison from legitimate players in the industry, and build bridges to policymakers, regulators, and kind of try and bring the two sides together.
Right. Somebody had to.
Right, to usher this forward, right?
Yeah. And you still hold that seat today. You're bringing the regulatory supervisory world in to meet with the good guys on the investing side and bring them closer together, because historically
Right.
there's been this wall,
Right.
that a virtual wall that really shouldn't exist.
Yeah, I find it's not even just with the regulators and policymakers, it's even with kind of mainstream traditional players in financial institutions or Wall
Right.
Street, right?
Right.
And I think that the way the technologists that I know, particularly in the crypto space, but just across a variety of technologies, think about this technology like crypto,
Right.
and the way policymakers or regulators or even Wall Street and some traditional financial institutions think about this technology are very different.
Yeah.
And there's a real need to bridge that gap. And so that's what I'm trying to do now. And I started that with vis-a-vis the policymakers and regulators when I was still in the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Right.
And so through that work, I got to know more and more of, I'll just call them the legitimate players of the industry, and there are many, and that number's growing.
Yep.
And those guys and gals, they don't want nefarious activity on their platforms, right?
Right.
Not only is it illegal, but it's also bad for business.
Yep.
And so they are very much incentivized to follow the law and follow regulations. They just would tell you, we don't know what laws and regulations apply to us, which I think is a fair criticism, right? There's been a lot of regulatory uncertainty, particularly in this space.
Yeah.
And so it was time for me to go from the government, and yet there's this whole other world I wanted to kind of dive deeper into. And so I was very fortunate in May, 2 years ago, I joined the board of directors of Coinbase,
Yep.
which is one of the world's leading digital asset platforms.
Yep.
And so I joined that board, and there I met my now partner, Chris Dixon. And I also, through that work, met a variety of other venture capital firms, but also met Ben Horowitz and Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz. And so kind of got to know them while I was serving on the board of one of their portfolio companies, Coinbase. I also joined the board of a cybersecurity company called HackerOne, which is a bug bounty white hat hacking platform.
Yeah.
And again, I think HackerOne is a great example of kind of, you think of hackers sometimes and you think of like black hat hackers and this image of people doing bad, but actually white hat hackers are some of our best defenses against the black hat hackers.
Absolutely. And
Right.
so you moved through the U.S. Attorney's Office and into your core competencies and have brought those to
Yeah.
the investing side, the corporate side from the board perspective, and then the investing side
Yeah.
on how you think about these things going forward. And
Yeah.
I think everyone watching is going to be most interested now in how understanding how you're thinking about where there are opportunities to invest. Where are you, more broadly speaking, where do you think this opportunity is
Sure.
in the next 10 years, since
Yeah.
you guys invest on a long-term time horizon? What types of things are you looking at?
Yeah. Well, so I think, let me break it down in kind of two big categories, okay? And we'll talk about each separately.
Sure.
One is what I would call the category of literally internet money, okay? We've had this internet of information, right? The internet has connected billions of people around the world through information. But the thing that we don't have and that we've been missing is the internet of value. Why is it that today, if you're over in India, I could send you an email with contents instantly. I could send you a photograph from here to there instantly, but I couldn't send you value, right? And so I think that's one big category, is the internet of value and internet money, which we'll talk about in a second. The other way that we're thinking about this is as a new computing platform. So kind of what you see in the history of technology is about every 10 to 15 years, there's some new computing platform that emerges. Like we had PCs, and then we had the internet, right? And then we had mobile. And now we think of crypto as a new computing platform, like kind of totally a part of the currency side of things.
Okay.
And this is a discussion I know you and I have had. It's not just
This
currency.
is where our debate's going to get more lively.
Okay, so we think of this as a new computing platform.
Okay.
And what you often see with new computing platforms is you often see kind of people thinking at the new, well, wait a second, this isn't even better than the old. This is worse than the old, right? Like in the case of mobile, when the mobile phone came out, people thought, some thought, why would I want a smaller screen than my PC?
Right.
Right? Why would I want a tiny little keyboard like this, right?
Yep.
When I have a regular keyboard.
Yep.
But what you get with these new computing platforms is new features. And so in the case of mobile, what you had that the old platform didn't have is you had GPS built in, you had a camera built in. And that enabled things to be built on top that we couldn't have even imagined at the time the new platform came out, like
Right.
Lyft or Uber, Instagram, and all of these new kind of applications that are built on the new computing platform. And so in much the same way, we think of crypto as a new platform, a new decentralized platform. That decentralized apps, or they're called dApps.
Okay.
And I think that's a term you're going to be hearing, and your viewers are going to be hearing a lot in the coming decades.
dApps.
dApps, decentralized applications.
Okay.
Okay, and the thing about dApps is they can be built at scale by anyone all around the world. And there's some interesting overlays with crypto about incentivizing kind of content creators and creators of these applications that they're able to kind of monetize for what they're creating and building in ways that they previously weren't with just pure applications, not dApps, but apps, where they're paying huge kind of profit margin to some of the platforms that they're on now.
Right. Right, they're giving away a third of their value if they have to sit on top of another
That's right.
platform.
And by the way, it's not just the value. Can I also tell you, it's also the platform risk, right?
Okay, true.
If one of these platforms decides they don't want to service that anymore, they
They
just
just turn
simply
you off.
turn you off.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a lot of deplatforming now, right?
Okay.
And it's not just that, it's, they write the rules. A few big giants really write the rules for everyone else.
Yeah.
And so we think in this wave of decentralized apps or dApps, that's
You don't have to have a boss.
right.
Yeah.
Now, we're in the early days, and I think
Yeah.
this is a debate that we've had before and that I have with many people all the time. And I think it's really important not to judge the current state of innovation with the end state of innovation. Because
Okay.
you could tell me right now, well, it's janky, it doesn't work, and I'll agree with you.
Yeah.
We're not there yet.
I'd actually like to rewind and talk about.
Sure.
Let's talk about crypto assets, and so we separate crypto from blockchain, crypto from digital assets to a certain extent, and we talk about this idea of does scarcity equal value, and can you transfer value, like the example you gave for India, from here to India or here to a different location around the world. Should we be able to transfer value without know your customer rules, without Federal Reserve wires, or without Federal Reserve oversight? Should you and I be able to transfer value somewhere unchecked? And when we think about, you mentioned much earlier in our conversation, a libertarian
Yeah.
paradise. When I speak with people in the crypto community and people in the highest echelons of this community that were early adopters and are extremely wealthy today, I hear a little bit more than libertarian out of them when I talk to them. I get them after half an hour and maybe a glass of whiskey or two. I get to this point where I hear anarchy. I hear a little bit of, we don't need any government. We don't need anyone looking over our shoulder. And where do you fit in that argument? Or let's say where's your own opinion?
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly not an anarchist. And I
Right.
think that, there's a segment of that, of course, in crypto. There's a segment of that in all kinds of, new platforms that comes out. So I think that crypto is really no exception, although it is pronounced. I would give you that in the crypto space. But, look, I worked for the feds for 12 years. I'm not an anarchist. I think there's a rightful and a legitimate place for government, and I think it can do a lot of good.
Sure.
I think what you see in this space is people and legitimate players, of which there are many, and the number is growing literally by the day, do not say we don't want any regulation at all. They just say we want to know, number one, who is the regulator? Because right now it's a bit of a free-for-all.
Absolutely.
And we want to know what regulations apply to us, and we will follow them. What they can't tolerate, and what's just impractical as you build a business, in any business, can you imagine as you're doing a startup and you have some innovative product that you are told, well, we have 50 different regulators. We don't know which one might or might not regulate you. And by the way, none of them really know which of their regulations apply to you.
That's like living in San Francisco.
It's actually worse than that. And so what they want is, it's not that they want no regulation and no government. I think
Okay.
what they want is they want some regulatory
Streamlined.
clarity.
Yeah.
And you look to places like Singapore, and you look to places like the UK, who has this, a kind of single financial regulator with the FCA.
Yep.
They have this new sandbox for financial innovation. And they've really made a push to be the fintech hub of the world. And what we see, unfortunately, is we're seeing more and more projects moving overseas because
Sure.
they're like, well, I can kind of go apply for a sandbox. I know I have a single regulator. So that's not someone looking to skirt
That's always
all
been
laws.
London's strength, right?
Right.
They've always been, maybe a financial clearinghouse for the world.
Right.
Much more than the U.S. because,
Yeah.
truthfully, they have laws that aren't as stringent as ours.
That's right. But on the other hand, they know what the crypto entrepreneurs know what the laws are.
I see.
Okay. And
Is that going to happen here?
Well, so one of the things that is increasingly happening is we're seeing agencies like the CFTC. One of the big questions in the crypto space is, I'll give you a great example.
it? Yeah.
Is it the SEC?
Right.
Is it the CFTC?
It's kind of a land grab from a regulator's perspective. They'd
there's-
all like to be functionally relevant.
That's right. But
Right.
then what you have with crypto is you have this new asset class that maybe at one time something's a security, but then it changes over time to a commodity. And at what point does that happen?
Right.
And kind of who regulates it? Where's the handoff? Is there a handoff? So I would push back on the assumption that people in the crypto space don't want to follow laws and don't want to follow regulations. I think they just want to know which laws are relevant, and that's something I'm trying to help with now, and try and be part of those conversations.
Yeah. Well, the bigger question for me, as I know you and I have discussed, is, what happens to the global financial order
Right.
if it becomes decentralized? And I mean that in a way that we know the SWIFT system is designed. It's right. It's based in Belgium for a reason. It's where all financial wires go through, and it's how the U.S. Treasury exercises its, let's call it its third arrow in its quiver, the big one. When we as a country or other European bloc nations implement sanctions on bad actors, we just our last move is to just cancel them, take them off the SWIFT system, which means they can't move money around the world outside of shrink wrap pallets of $100 bills.
Sure, like with Treasury regulations, right?
Yeah, which we're doing. We're doing now on various bad actors in Iran and other places. So when I think about decentralized, or I think about crypto, I wonder how in a rules-based order it actually can coexist with governments that are actually functioning democracies.
Sure. Well, so it's a great question, and it's something I spend a lot of time thinking about. Like, what does the world look like where you have complete, and we don't have it yet, we're in the dial-up days of all of this technology. So when I talk about complete decentralization, I don't mean to suggest that we're there, but I do think that's coming, and I'll get to that. To answer your question, though, Kyle, look, I think you mentioned SWIFT, and that's a great example. The problem with SWIFT is the problem with any centralized system. There's a single point of failure, which can be good for regulation, what you're talking about, if it's appropriately exercised, government authorities appropriately exercised using discretion. However, the problem with the centralized system is it's a single point of failure. And SWIFT's a great example because SWIFT was hacked. And where we live in a world of kind of daily cyber breaches, centralized systems are huge targets and huge honeypots. So I think that's one problem with centralized systems, which decentralization is obviously an alternative to that. But also when you talk about kind of Treasury sanctions, whether you're talking about FinCEN, 311, or OFAC sanctions, it's a great question. Should people just be able to move value around? And look, I would say our current system, anti-money laundering laws are critically important. I can tell you that as having been a money laundering prosecutor for 10 years. Of course I care about that. And you need the ability to follow funds in certain cases. But actually our current system is just doing a pretty terrible job of it, I'd say. Let me tell you what I mean. 99.9% of all money laundering crimes go unprosecuted. 99.9%. And you can go Google that statistic. I testified before the U.S. Senate about this, and the person who cited that statistic, other than Senator Chuck Grassley, was the ex-Treasury official. And I thought that can't be right.
Who was in charge,
right? But I researched into it, and it's true. Go look it up now. 99.9% of money laundering crimes go unprosecuted. Okay. Yet financial services industry is spending $20 billion a year on AML and KYC. So I would ask you, is it even working? I don't think it's working right now. Okay, so the moving to a decentralized system, I think is really, I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that's going to change too much. I do think there is need to follow large amounts of money, and crypto will make that hard as we move to a peer-to-peer system. Perhaps there could be some limits on when the amount is over, a certain amount of crypto asset. I don't know what the right answer is, but I know that the technology is here and the genie's out of the bottle. So to say, oh, well, this is bad and peer-to-peer transmission is going to, subvert important terrorist financing rules, I would ask you, first of all, are we sure we're really catching those things now?
Right.
The fact of the matter is terrorist attacks that we're seeing now are committed usually with things like guns or trucks. They're not sophisticated operations. They cost a few $1,000s. Those folks are using cash or they're using prepaid cards or systems like that. They're not exactly doing it in a traceable way.
I don't know. Look, ISIS had $2 billion. They still have $400 million. And I think it's a widely known secret that it's all in Turkey and the Turkish banks, and it's run by technically legitimate businessmen who decide to launder money. And it's hard to decipher when you're running a business that actually is legitimate. And if you're giving that to terrorists, it's really hard to catch.
Sure, but I think I would say that's hard to catch now.
No, I
Yeah.
agree. I'm just saying that if the U.S. is looking to sanction bad actors, and let's just say bad sovereign actors, and people within those sovereigns, we can actually stop it today.
Right.
Or let's say, stop it. We can actually make it really difficult for them to
Right.
move substantial amounts of capital anywhere or do business
That's true.
with U.S. banks.
That's true.
Or
when
let's say
they're
Western banks.
When they're traced and when they're caught. I agree that is true. But I would also say, at what cost do you do that? You have 2 billion people in the world today who don't have a bank account,
Right.
who have zero access to financial services.
Right.
They can't pay for things easily. And aside from paying for things or storing value, they also are not able to do basic things like get a loan.
Right.
And so you've got 2
This is
billion.
the idea for mobile banking. And
Sure. And you've got 2 billion people with no access to, well, mobile banking implies you have a bank account, right? So
Yep.
crypto really offers 2 billion people the ability
Yeah.
to access what I would.
They're
yeah.
positive things, right? The
Right.
Crypto in Argentina, crypto in Venezuela, and these countries that have the sovereigns really blown it, either
Sure.
politically or financially or both.
Yeah. Hyperinflation economies.
It's been a way that for people to actually save the store value of their savings instead of let some rogue government basically light it on fire. And
Yeah.
so by the way, I haven't, maybe I haven't even told you this. Now I'm a shareholder of a crypto.
You did
company,
mention that,
right?
yeah.
I came in kicking and screaming through an acquisition, but now I'm rooting for it in its totality. And I've just sat on the sidelines all along because I have to see a logical, regulated, positive use for this asset class for me to jump in with my assets.
Sure.
But those early pioneers, again, these are the people that just went west for the gold rush.
Yeah.
They made fortunes.
Yeah.
Right? I wasn't in that tip of the spear. I'm waiting for it to settle down and figure out how to properly operate it, in an environment where there is a regulator, whether
Yeah.
it's the CFTC or the SEC or the Fed or whoever the regulator is going to be. I actually believe that these assets will be something. There'll be some asset that actually holds is store value and medium of exchange.
Right. And so you have those assets, and things need to be solved for that to happen too, by the way. I mean, you talked about Venezuela. There's no denying that crypto prices have been all over, right? They are volatile so
Yes.
far. Once upon a time, gold also experienced quite a bit of volatility. As you know, particularly in the 70s, it lost
Yeah.
30% of its value in a very short time frame. And so right now, as a medium of exchange, crypto hasn't yet achieved its full promise, or even,
Yeah.
frankly, even close to it because
It
of the
won't
volatility.
until volatility comes down.
And that's where things like stable coins come into play. You have USDC is a good example, where for every dollar of USDC, you have an actual dollar in a bank somewhere.
Okay.
Right? That's one model of stable coins, fiat-backed. There are also algorithmic stable coins, which is essentially, and gets really blow your mind complicated, but it's essentially a smart contract that adjusts what the collateral is backing the stable coin.
Dear God.
Okay. And so this is a whole other variety of stable coins that
Okay.
we have. And so there are fiat backed, but then there are also crypto asset backed. And so there is some collateral backing it, but it's all controlled by this autonomous, self-executing smart contract.
Dear Lord.
Very complicated.
So you guys are on the forefront of a new industry, a new asset class, something that's, I think, mathematically and intellectually so fascinating. And then
Yeah.
practically to interface with the old world, there are going to be, frictions that continue.
Yeah.
And let's hope that the bad actors get taken out of this space, and that I think the space is going to grow like crazy with
Yep.
or without additional deep regulation. But I think knowing you and knowing what you guys are doing is it's been fun, and I really appreciate you taking the time to sit and talk about these things. I think people are going to find it to be fascinating.